The perfect diet doesn't exist. I'm telling you this because if you spend enough time on social media, it's easy to start believing that a perfect diet exists. A way of eating that's superior to all the others, and that you're missing out on if you don't follow certain creators. One that's supposedly good for everyone. I'm Dr. Borja Bandera, a specialist in endocrinology and nutrition, and today I'm here to convince you that it doesn't work that way. There isn't a single optimal human diet. Why? Because we're not all the same. Not genetics, not metabolism, not environment, not culture, not activity level, not food availability, not local tradition. None of that is the same between people or between populations. But do you know what does exist? There are common elements in all diets that protect and promote the health of a population. That's what we're talking about today. Because when you analyze the healthiest dietary patterns in the world, you find something interesting. None of them are identical to each other, but they share a series of traits. So let's look at the 17 traits I've found in eating patterns that protect your health, functionality, and longevity. But before we get into those elements, there's a preliminary question we all need to answer together. What are the minimum characteristics a diet must have to be considered healthy? That is the bare minimum requirement. After evaluating dozens of diets, you learn that the best one isn't the most popular, the most talked about on social media, or the one that includes the most exotic foods. The best one has to meet at least 6 conditions that are always the same. First, it should be associated with a lower risk of non-communicable chronic diseases, such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, or metabolic disorders. And here, plant-based diets come out on top in practically all studies. Second, they preserve functional capacity and protect muscle mass, because living longer is pointless if you reach your later decades in worse condition. Third, ensuring a sufficient intake of essential nutrients, meaning a diet that in the long run does not cause clinical or subclinical deficiencies. It's a good diet. For this, you need nutritional density and a certain degree of variety, but be careful, not extreme variety either. Fourth characteristic, making it easier to maintain a healthy body composition without turning food into a daily battle. Fifth, it should be sustainable in daily life, easy to follow, without hunger, suffering, or obsession with perfect eating. And sixth, it should be economically viable, because a diet that is excellent in theory but inaccessible in practice is not a useful diet. Almost nobody takes this point into account. And now, with that clear definition, let's look at the elements that many diets optimized for health share in addition to these. The first element is that they are not hyper-palatable diets. This might sound strange at first, but it's fundamental. A good diet can't be designed so that you want to keep eating indefinitely. And far from being a drawback, that's a huge advantage. The industry knows this. When your diet is based on ultra-processed foods with very intense flavors, textures, and smells, your nervous system loses its ability to self-regulate. Eating stops depending on physiological hunger and becomes much more influenced by impulse, stimulation, conditioning, habit, and gratification. In other words, if a meal is designed to make it hard for you to stop, you have a problem. I'm not saying that a healthy diet has to be sad, bland, or ascetic. No, this isn't about eating cardboard. It's about making it relatively easy to stop eating when you feel full. That makes sense, doesn't it? If we've already satisfied that physiological need, it makes sense to move on to something else. Well, this can be designed when planning a diet. Because it's harder for all of us to stop eating bagged potato chips than a plate of lentils. The next point also has nothing to do with carbohydrates, proteins, or calories. Healthy diets include eating together. Eating well is not just about taking in nutrients. It's also a way to connect with others. Commensality, sharing food with other people, is part of almost every tradition and culture. Around a table, customs are passed on, bonds are strengthened, family and cultural identities are consolidated, and something very valuable for human health is created, a sense of belonging. Eating with family, gathering with friends, celebrating a birthday, a fair, a community meal, a wedding, a baptism, any shared ritual has a value that goes far beyond what's on the plate and its calories. And this stands in stark contrast to the way people eat in 2026 glued to a screen watching stupid reels. Although, of course, our Western culture makes it very easy for us to confuse commensality with excess. Sharing the act of eating shouldn't be associated with excess food, alcohol, desserts, or eating frequency, as often happens. Because then, the social aspect still contributes, of course, but it will be partially offset by an eating pattern that is no longer adaptive and healthy. Remember that a healthy diet shouldn't exclude social life, it should integrate it. Now we're starting to talk about nutrients, but probably not the one you expect. Third, healthy diets are always rich in fiber. If I had to point out one of the most underrated nutrients in modern nutrition, it would be fiber. The vast majority of people consume less fiber than they should, even though its impact on health is enormous. Fiber is associated with better satiety, better appetite control, improved intestinal transit, a healthier microbiota, and a protective metabolic profile. In addition, a high intake is associated with a lower risk of various chronic diseases and with lower overall mortality. And this makes perfect sense because when you increase fiber, you're not just adding fiber. You're replacing nutritionally poor foods and adding more legumes, fruit, vegetables, nuts, whole grains, and seeds. You're indirectly producing more beneficial postbiotics. You're improving your body composition. Even in this recent episode of Better Than Yesterday, we saw that you could be improving your strength without even knowing it. Roseberry, my practical recommendation is clear. Aim for a minimum of 30 grams per day, and if your digestive tolerance allows, you can gradually increase to higher amounts over time. We see, for example, that modern hunter-gatherer populations can reach amounts higher than 70 grams of fiber on some days. That's a lot. Does your daily diet really include enough fiber-rich foods, or do you just think it does? If you actually start counting, you'll see that most people don't meet this requirement. Fourth, healthy diets respect local culture. A diet works much better when it doesn't force you to turn your back on your own context. Adapting your diet to the culinary culture of your environment is an adherent strategy that few people follow and few professionals as well. Local culinary traditions usually arise from geography, climate, culture, food availability, and the history of a community. Often, they hold more nutritional wisdom than the whole internet. And yes, if you're a professional, sometimes you'll have to research and adapt to those local traditional norms of the place where your client lives. The big mistake of recent decades has been trying to impose the same homogeneous dietary model on everyone, as if eating in Malaga, Mexico, Japan, or Norway should be the same. A good diet usually connects with your territory, your roots, with the way your family has cooked for generations. And that, besides making practical sense, usually makes it much easier to maintain. And yes, there are also unhealthy cultural dietary patterns based on flour with too many pastries or high-calorie dishes. Obviously, you have to know how to choose. Using my city as an example, both the Malaga-style fried fish and the Malaga salad are typical dishes. Clearly, you know which should be more common in your diet. Because healthy diets have little marketing from the food industry behind them. Here's a pretty useful clue. The best foundations of a good diet usually don't come wrapped in aggressive campaigns, flashy health claims, or miraculous promises. You already know that. They don't contain foods that are usually advertised. They don't need much marketing because they've existed for centuries. Ultra-processed foods, on the other hand, depend heavily on marketing, based on packaging, messaging, convenience, claims, constant reformulations, fit versions, easy high-protein versions, light versions. That doesn't mean that healthy dietary patterns shouldn't be promoted. I wish they were promoted like ultra-processed foods. On the contrary, they should be studied more, spread more, and take up much more space in public health. But that's not what usually happens outside of an academic setting. Sixth point, healthy diets include sustainable, local, and seasonal products. A well-designed diet should not only take care of your physical health, but also your wallet and your environment, which in turn affects your physical health. When you prioritize as much as possible local foods and seasonal products, several things usually happen. First, you buy fresher, you pay less, you support the local economy, and you reduce part of the environmental cost associated with distribution chains that are absurdly long. Also, getting back to seasonal logic reconnects you with something we've lost, understanding that not everything has to be available on the table all the time. Eating everything all the time is an artificial idea. What if food was always available? Can you name the natural season for strawberries, tomatoes, loquats, or peppers without pausing? I have to look it up, but my grandfather could tell you instantly, for example. He used to plant many of those things himself. And this makes me think and says a lot about how disconnected we are from the real origin of food. Seventh, healthy diets have low to moderate calorie density and high nutrient density. This principle helps you eat well without always feeling restricted. The most interesting foods for health usually provide a lot of nutrients in relation to the calories they contain. Vegetables, fruits, legumes, minimally processed tubers, lean sources of protein, nuts in reasonable amounts, and seeds are good examples. On the other hand, many ultra-processed foods provide lots of calories in small portions but little nutritional value. And that's a perfect trap to eat more than you should without really feeling full. That's why one of the pillars of an optimized diet is to build most of your eating pattern around foods with high nutritional density and low caloric density, or at least a manageable caloric density that's adapted to your context. Not because calories are bad, but the body reacts very differently to 500 calories from processed pastries versus 500 calories from legumes, vegetables, fish, fruit, or plain yogurt. Remember, if you train 10 hours a week, your situation is different, and you'll likely need more ultra-processed calories, but that's a separate context from this video. 8. Healthy diets provide enough protein to protect muscle mass. This is the point, one of the decisive points. You can design a flawless diet on paper, but if you lose muscle mass with it, that diet is not good, especially if we're talking about healthy aging. You already know that muscle mass is not a cosmetic luxury, it's functional reserve, autonomy, insulin sensitivity, protection against frailty, and a better prognosis in almost all clinical contexts. A full-fledged health insurance that you pay for with every workout. To preserve it, you need at least 3 things. Enough energy, enough protein, and adequate mechanical stimulus. If you ask me, the most common mistake now isn't about protein, there's already plenty. Many people mostly fail at the third point. They don't train with enough intensity to send a useful message to the muscle that it should stay in your body. In practice, for a sedentary person with a reasonable body composition, getting around 1.2 grams per kilo per day is usually enough to maintain lean mass. If you train very frequently, with a lot of intensity, or if you're in a situation where you want to better protect your lean mass, it makes sense to raise that range a bit. For marked obesity, adjust carefully to avoid overestimating protein needs based on total body weight. That's also a common mistake. The important idea here is to understand that no longevity diet can sacrifice muscle. Also related to this, be careful with the misuse of GLP-1 receptor analogs. Number 9, healthy diets prioritize monounsaturated fats. When we talk about quality fat sources, a constant in many healthy patterns is the prominence of monounsaturated fats, especially through extra virgin olive oil and, in other contexts, also avocado and certain nuts. Within the overall dietary pattern, these sources fit very well because they provide reasonable palatability, good nutritional density, and a favorable lipid profile. On a practical level, a very simple step is to establish a stable routine. For example, using extra virgin olive oil as the main fat for dressing and cooking, or frequently including foods rich in this type of fat in dishes you eat regularly, such as salads. The key is for it to become a natural part of your way of eating. 10. Healthy diets are very rich in bioactive compounds. An excellent diet not only covers proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals, it also usually provides a huge variety of bioactive compounds. I'm talking about polyphenols and many other substances naturally present in fruits, vegetables, legumes and herbs, spices, tea, cocoa, or some fermented foods. They are the added value of a diet based on minimally processed and varied plant foods. In practice, this means something very simple. The more real plant diversity you have in your diet, the more likely you are to be incorporating these kinds of compounds. Blueberries, broccoli, tomato, grapes, citrus fruits, garlic, soy, artichokes, pure cocoa, leafy greens, green tea. How many of these foods show up regularly in your week? It's not difficult, especially today with AI, to create a diet system where, without even realizing it, you're incorporating 4 or 5 of these foods rich in bioactive compounds every day. Healthy diets have minimally processed. This is probably one of the most defining traits. Be careful. A good diet is not an unprocessed diet. That's a utopian idea. That doesn't exist. Cooking is already processing. Fermenting, pasteurizing, freezing, grinding, canning are also forms of processing, and many of them can be useful and beneficial. The issue isn't processing, it's ultra-processing. Extreme industrial ultra-processing transforms recognizable raw materials into products designed to be hyper-palatable, cheap, long-lasting, and very easy to overconsume. That's the important difference. A tomato cooked in a sofrito is still a tomato, and in addition, it can even improve the nutritional value of a healthy diet. And most of the ultra-processed foods in the world no longer have a reasonable relationship with the original food they come from. And the more your diet is based on the latter, the more the overall pattern deteriorates. Healthy diets are usually isoenergetic or include a slight caloric restriction. This is also essential. You can eat excellent foods, but if your chronic energy balance pushes you to gain fat consistently above a healthy threshold, the diet stops being optimal, even if it includes optimal foods. Do you understand the difference? The dietary patterns most compatible with health and longevity are usually occur under conditions of energy balance or, in some cases, a slight, sustained, and tolerable restriction. When chronic energy surplus becomes normalized, there is a progressive increase in adipose tissue, a worse metabolic profile, and sustained activation of anabolic pathways that, without proper counterbalance, do not favor long-term health. It's common for previous generations who learned to cook from our grandparents, who in turn cooked in a much more physical and different environment than today, to continue cooking in such a high-calorie way. Have you noticed? Today's challenge is adapting to the new digital and sedentary environment. 13. Healthy diets are low in simple sugars and refined flours. The problem isn't that an occasional sugary food is going to destroy your health. The problem is the repeated, habitual, day-to-day exposure to a pattern loaded with refined carbohydrates and fast-absorbing sugars, especially when it's also combined with a sedentary lifestyle and excess calories. That's the harmful triangle, when a person is chronically overfed. They move very little and base a good part of their intake on refined products. The body gradually loses metabolic flexibility. More frequent glycemic spikes appear, there's a higher insulin demand, and a progressive tendency toward insulin resistance. You ruin your metabolism. You have to see sugar and refined flours as something to eat away from home, not at home. This change in mindset by itself puts you way ahead of most people. 14. Healthy diets clearly exclude or minimize alcohol. If we evaluate alcohol purely from a physiological point of view or its impact on health, there is no solid basis to recommend its consumption. This is the reality, no basis at all. Another thing altogether is recognizing that, in real life, alcohol often appears linked to celebration, dining together, and certain social rituals. That's why simply saying don't drink alcohol doesn't always solve the issue. Do you remember when, in the episode with Antonio Valenzuela, he said that one of the problems of modern society is that we need more rituals? I'll leave you to reflect on that. Now, of course, I'm not justifying alcohol consumption here. You understand and know what I mean. That is, just because alcohol has a social function doesn't make it healthy. Each person must decide their desired level of ambition for health and life, their risk tolerance, and how this fits with their environment. But we can say that many people who consider themselves healthy drink much more than they think. It's the typical habit where we fool ourselves. So it's worth reviewing your weekly consumption calmly, without self-deception, and without excessive judgment toward ourselves or others. 15. Healthy diets contain few additives. Not all additives deserve the same level of concern. But in general, when the foundation of your diet is made up of real, minimally processed foods, your exposure to complex mixtures of preservatives, bleaching agents, emulsifiers, sweeteners, thickeners, and flavorings is very small. It decreases significantly. And that works in your favor and in favor of your microbiota. Why? Because many of these compounds are there to improve the shelf life of the product, make it more stable, more attractive, sweeter, creamier, more acidic, more addictive, and more profitable. But not to improve your health, that's clear. And the smartest way, from my point of view, to approach this topic is not to live in fear of every E-number. E-numbers should just be the exception on a Saturday afternoon, and that's it. 16. Healthy diets. Healthy habits are part of an overall lifestyle, one of the most powerful messages in the whole video. We shouldn't make everything about diet, guys. Diet matters a lot, yes, but it doesn't explain a person's health on its own. Sleeping well matters, moving matters, having healthy relationships matters, not being held hostage by stress, anger, or hopelessness matters, having purpose matters. People who truly eat well and do so for years and decades usually aren't thinking about their diet all day long. They don't obsessively track if they ate legumes, missed extra virgin olive oil, or met a leafy green quota. They just eat that way because it's normal for them. They don't exaggerate it, nor do they give it more or less importance. It's part of their habits, their identity, their culture, their home. And I find that very powerful. Think about your grandparents or great-grandparents if you got to know them. Many of them didn't follow a diet. They simply ate in a specific way, deeply rooted in their tradition, their economy, and their environment. And 17. Healthy diets are pleasant to experience. They are also economically reasonable. I want to close this list with something that runs through everything I've said before. A diet can't be considered optimal if it makes you feel miserable. If it makes you hungry, if it isolates you socially, like the typical bodybuilder diet, if it forces you to live by impossible rules, or if only someone with a lot of time, a lot of money, or a very high tolerance for rigidity can maintain it. A truly good diet has to be enjoyable, flexible enough, and affordable enough, so that you can stick to it for years. So no, there isn't a single ideal diet for everyone. But there are common principles that appear again and again when we look at the dietary patterns most compatible with health, functionality, and longevity. If you're a health professional seeking training in scientific evidence-based longevity, check out our master's program, Método Chronos, now in its 3rd edition. The best researchers, teachers, and clinicians in longevity will train you so you can grow in this exciting field. So if you're interested, I'll leave the information here for you. See you in the next video. Big hug. Let's keep empowering each other.